Amanda had always dreamed of living alone, the idea of having her own space, decorating it to her taste, and enjoying the quiet moments had always appealed to her. So when she finally found the perfect apartment in a quaint little town in the middle of nowhere, she jumped at the opportunity. The place was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors, large windows that let in just the right amount of light, and a fireplace that added a cozy touch to the living room. The first night was peaceful. Amanda curled up on the couch with a book, the crackling fire keeping her warm as she sipped on a cup of tea. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the floorboards and the wind whistling through the trees outside. It was everything she had imagined and more. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to creep over her. It was as if the silence was growing thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. After all, it was her first night in a new place, and it was only natural to feel a little unsettled. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the whisper of a breath just behind her. She froze, her heart racing as she strained to listen. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, but still too soft to make out. Amanda slowly turned her head, scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing there. She shook her head, trying to laugh it off. "I'm just tired," she muttered to herself. "It's nothing." But deep down, she knew it wasn't nothing. She could feel that something was off, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The silence that had once felt so peaceful now seemed oppressive, almost malevolent. She decided to go to bed, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear her mind. But as she lay in the darkness, the feeling only grew stronger. The silence was no longer just silence, it was a presence lurking in the shadows, watching her, waiting for her to fall asleep. And then the whispers began. The first night Amanda heard the whispers, she thought it was just a dream. They were faint, almost like the wind rustling through the trees, but they seemed to be coming from inside her bedroom. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding as she listened, but the room was silent, just the old wooden floors creaking, just the wind outside. But the next night the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. Amanda could hear them clearly now, though she couldn't make out the words. They seemed to come from all around her, filling the room with their eerie, disjointed murmurs. She turned on the lights, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to grow louder, as if the light only made them bolder. Panic gripped her as she realized they were coming from right next to her, as if someone was standing at the foot of her bed, whispering into the darkness. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling, but the only response was a low, almost mocking laugh that sent chills down her spine. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in bed, clutching the blankets around her, her eyes darting around the room as the whispers continued to swirl around her. They didn't stop until the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, and then, as suddenly as they had started, they were gone. Amanda was exhausted, but she knew she couldn't stay in that apartment. She needed to get out, to find somewhere else to stay until she could figure out what was going on. But when she tried to leave, she found that the door wouldn't open, no matter how hard she pulled. It was as if it was glued shut. She was trapped. Days turned into weeks, and Amanda's once cozy apartment became a prison. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, and more terrifying. They spoke of things she couldn't understand, ancient rituals, forgotten gods, and names she had never heard before. But one thing was clear. They were angry, and they wanted her gone. The atmosphere in the apartment changed. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Amanda felt like she was constantly being watched, even during the day. Every time she tried to leave, the door remained stubbornly locked, as if mocking her attempts to escape. She tried calling for help, but her phone wouldn't work. The landline was dead, and even the internet was down. It was as if the apartment was cut off from the outside world, existing in some kind of liminal space where time and reality were distorted. The whispers were no longer confined to the night. They followed her everywhere, growing louder and more menacing with each passing day. She could hear them in the walls, in the floorboards, even in the very air she breathed. They surrounded her, suffocating her with their relentless, maddening presence. And then came the scratching. It started as a faint noise, like the sound of a mouse scurrying behind the walls. But it quickly grew louder, more frantic, until it was as if something was trying to claw its way out of the walls. The sound was unbearable, a constant, torturous scraping that echoed through the apartment, driving Amanda to the brink of insanity. She tried to block it out, covering her ears, blasting music, anything to drown out the noise. But it was no use. The scratching was inside her head now, a relentless, maddening cacophony that wouldn't stop. And then, one night, as she lay in bed, the scratching suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden, so complete, that it was almost deafening. Amanda lay there, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for the next wave of terror to wash over her. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a single loud knock at the door. Amanda's blood ran cold. She had been trapped in the apartment for weeks, with no sign of life outside. Who could possibly be knocking on her door? The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She forced herself to get out of bed, her legs trembling as she approached the door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally turning it. To her surprise, the door opened easily, as if it had never been locked. But when she looked outside, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind through the open window at the end of the corridor. She stepped out into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating, as if the entire building was holding its breath. She looked around, but there was no sign of anyone, no neighbors, no movement, nothing. But then she felt it, a cold, icy breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out before her. But she could feel it, the presence lurking just out of sight, watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She backed away, her heart racing as she retreated into her apartment. But as she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside once again. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. They filled the room, swirling around her, closing in on her from all sides. She could feel the presence now, stronger than ever, as if it was right there in the room with her. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shrouded in shadows. Its eyes glowed a deep, malevolent red, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as it looked down at her. Amanda backed away, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure advanced on her. She could feel its cold, icy breath on her skin, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers closing around her throat, cutting off her air. She struggled, but it was no use. The darkness closed in around her, the whispers growing louder and louder, until they were all she could hear, drowning out everything else. And then, just as she was about to lose consciousness, the figure spoke. "You cannot escape." Amanda woke up in her bed, gasping for air. The apartment was silent, the oppressive weight of the presence gone. She looked around, her heart still racing, but there was no sign of the figure, no whispers, nothing. Had it all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by the stress of moving into a new place? She wanted to believe that, but deep down, she knew it wasn't true. The figure, the whispers, the presence, they were all too real. She got out of bed, her legs trembling as she made her way to the living room. The fire had gone out, leaving the room cold and dark. She wrapped a blanket around herself, trying to shake off the lingering fear, but as she sat there, staring into the darkness, she noticed something strange. The floorboards in front of the fireplace were scratched, as if someone had been clawing at them. She knelt down, her heart pounding as she ran her fingers over the deep gouges in the wood. And then she saw it. Megan had never been a fan of staying home alone, especially in her old, creaky house, but tonight she had no choice. Her parents were out of town, and her younger brother was spending the weekend with friends. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that seems to amplify every little sound. It was a stormy night, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Megan tried to distract herself by watching a movie, but her mind kept wandering. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and move, playing tricks on her eyes. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the growing unease gnawing at her. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then she realized it was something else, something inside the house. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone muttering just beneath their breath. Megan paused the movie and listened more closely. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls. She strained her ears, trying to make out the words, but they were too faint. Her heart began to race. The rational part of her brain told her it was just the wind or maybe the pipes, but the whispers sounded too human. She decided to investigate, grabbing her phone for light as she slowly walked through the dimly lit hallway. The whispers grew louder as she approached her bedroom. Her heart pounded in her chest as she opened the door, but the room was empty. She stepped inside, and the whispers stopped abruptly. Megan scanned the room, looking for anything out of place, but everything seemed normal. She let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. But just as she turned to leave, she heard it again, clearer this time. Megan, the voice was unmistakable, and it was coming from directly behind her. She spun around, her phone's flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was no one there. A cold chill ran down her spine as she realized the voice wasn't just a whisper in the walls, it was right in her ear. Panic surged through her, and she bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She ran to the living room, where she huddled on the couch, her heart racing. She dialed her parents' number, but the call went straight to voicemail. Desperate, She tried her brother, but he didn't answer either. Megan was alone, truly alone, and something was in the house with her. The whispers started again, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around her, surrounding her. Megan covered her ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, more insistent. Megan, come to us. She couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her keys and ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock in her panic. Just as she wrenched the door open, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, almost oppressive. Megan stood frozen in the doorway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned back to look at the house, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. But then she saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching her with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Without a second thought, Megan ran out of the house, not stopping until she was safely in her car. She drove away as fast as she could, not daring to look back. It wasn't until she was miles away, parked in a well-lit gas station, that she finally allowed herself to breathe. She called her parents again, begging them to come home, and they promised to be back by morning. But Megan knew she wouldn't be going back to that house alone ever again. Jake was a night owl, often staying up late into the night, lost in the world of video games. His parents were away for the weekend, leaving him with the house to himself. It was a rare treat, one he intended to make the most of. The hours ticked by, and soon it was past midnight. The house was dark except for the glow of his computer screen. The silence was only broken by the sounds of the game, and Jake was completely engrossed. That is, until he heard a knock. It was a soft, almost tentative sound, barely audible over the game. Jake paused. Pulling off his headphones, he waited, listening intently. The knock came again, this time louder and more distinct. Jake's first thought was that it might be one of his friends playing a prank. He checked his phone, no messages. He shrugged it off and returned to his game, but the knock came again, louder and more insistent. He finally got up. Annoyed, he went to the front door and looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. Confused, he opened the door slightly, peering out into the dark, empty street. A cold breeze swept in, sending a shiver down his spine. "Hello?" Jake called out, but there was no answer. He closed the door, feeling a bit uneasy. As he turned to go back to his room, the knock came again, this time from the back door. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. There was no way someone could have gotten to the back of the house that quickly. Slowly, he made his way to the kitchen, where the back door was located. The knock came again, louder this time, almost urgent. Jake hesitated before finally opening the door, but again there was no one there. The unease in his gut grew stronger. He was about to close the door when he noticed something on the ground, a small, crumpled piece of paper. He picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The message was scrawled in messy handwriting. "Let me in." Jake's blood ran cold. He dropped the note and slammed the door shut, locking it. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what was going on. Was someone messing with him, or was it something more sinister? As he stood there, trying to make sense of it all, the knock came again, this time from the living room window. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned to face the window. The curtains were drawn, but he could see a faint silhouette behind them. "Let me in," a voice whispered from the other side of the glass. Dake's breath caught in his throat. He backed away slowly, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. "Let me in." Jake couldn't take it any more. He bolted from the house, not stopping until he reached the safety of a neighbor's porch. He banged on the door until they let him in, shaking and terrified. The next morning, the police found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being in the house. But Jake knew what he had heard, what he had seen. He never stayed home alone again. It was a chilly autumn evening when Emily's parents left for their weekend getaway. They assured her they'd only be gone for 2 nights, leaving her alone in the big, old house. At 17, Emily was used to being home alone, but there was something unsettling about this particular night. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees or the shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of her vision. Whatever it was, it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The house, a Victorian-era structure, was full of creaks and groans. Emily had lived there her whole life, but she could never shake the feeling that something was watching her as the night deepened. The familiar noises became sharper, more distinct. The wooden floorboards creaked, as if someone was walking down the hall, but when she checked, the hall was empty. Emily shook off the feeling and decided to make herself some popcorn and watch a movie. She chose a light-hearted comedy to lift her spirits, hoping it would drown out the eerie silence. But halfway through the film, the power flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Just a storm, she told herself, though the night was eerily calm. She reached for her phone, but the battery was nearly dead. Her parents had left the landline connected, so she fumbled her way through the darkened house toward it. As she reached for the receiver, she noticed something strange and icy draft blowing through the house. The windows were shut tight, yet the cold air brushed against her skin, sending a chill down her spine. Suddenly the phone rang, its shrill tone echoing through the silent house. Startled, Emily hesitated before picking it up. "Hello," she stammered. There was no response, just static on the other end. Then a faint whisper, barely audible, sent her heart racing. "Get out," she froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading. "Who's this?" she demanded, but the line went dead. Emily's pulse quickened. She dropped the receiver and backed away, bumping into the small table behind her. The thud of something falling to the floor startled her, and she turned to see an old photograph of her family lying face down, its glass frame shattered. She didn't remember that picture being on the table. Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed from the second floor. It was a slow, deliberate pace, as if someone was making sure she heard them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had locked all the doors. When her parents left, there was no way anyone could be inside. Heart pounding, she grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly ascended the staircase. The floorboards creaked under her weight, mimicking the footsteps she had just heard at the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched out before her, each door shut tight except for one, the door to her parents' bedroom, which now stood ajar. She approached the room, every fiber of her being screaming at her to turn back, to run out of the house, but she pushed the fear aside. Her hand trembled as she nudged the door open with the tip of the knife. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, curtains billowing as the cold night air rushed in. Emily's eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of an intruder. That's when she saw it, a shadow, darker than the night, standing in the corner. UNMOVING. It wasn't the shadow of a person, but something twisted and unnatural. It seemed to pulse as if breathing. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized the shadow was watching her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Emily spun around, but there was no one there. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she turned back to the shadow, which had moved closer, almost within reach. In a desperate attempt to escape, Emily threw herself against the door, finally breaking it open. She bolted down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until she was halfway down the street. She looked back at the house, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. In a desperate attempt to escape, Emily threw herself against the door, finally breaking it open. She bolted down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until she was halfway down the street. She looked back at the house, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. The police arrived within minutes, but found no evidence of an intruder. The windows were shut, the doors locked, and the house was silent. But Emily knew what she felt, and as she watched the house from the safety of a neighbor's porch, she could have sworn she saw that same shadow flickering in the upstairs window, watching her, waiting for her to come back.